Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. It begins, as so many great cataclysms do, with a detail so small as to be almost insignificant, a piece of adhesive tape, not on a package, not on a wound, but on the latch of a door in the basement garage of a high-end Washington, D.C. office building. The building is the Watergate, a sprawling, curvilinear complex of luxury apartments, hotel rooms, and commercial space overlooking the Potomac River. The date is June 17, 1972. It is just after 1 in the morning. A security guard named Frank Wills is making his rounds. He's 24 years old, working a job that is usually defined by its monotony. A predictable circuit through silent, empty hallways. But tonight he notices the tape. It's horizontally placed over the latch bolt on a door leading from the garage stairwell to the building's B2 level. It's meant to keep the lock from engaging. He thinks nothing of it, assuming a maintenance worker, perhaps careless or forgetful, had left it there. He removes it and continues on his patrol, the minor anomaly already fading from his mind. An hour later, around 2 a.m., he returns to the same spot. The tape is back. The exact same door, the exact same tape, in the exact same position. This is no accident. This is deliberate. A cold prickle of unease runs through him, the kind of instinct that separates a routine night from a dangerous one. Every professional sense he has tells him something is profoundly wrong. The silent, empty building suddenly feels charged with a hidden presence. Wills walks to a lobby phone and dials the 2nd Precinct of the D.C. Metropolitan Police. His voice is calm, professional. He reports a suspected burglary in progress. He doesn't know that with this one quiet phone call, he has just tripped a wire that will eventually ensnare the most powerful man in the world. He has exposed the first frayed nerve ending of a vast criminal conspiracy. He has, without knowing it, initiated the fall of a president. When the plainclothes officers arrive, Sergeant Paul Leeper, Officer Carl Schaffler, and Officer John Barrett, they are met with a scene of bizarre, almost comical incompetence. They decide to conduct a floor-by-floor search. On the 6th floor, inside the dimly lit headquarters of the Democratic National Committee, they find evidence of a break-in. A door has been jimmied. They draw their weapons and begin to sweep the offices. They find 5 men. They are not dressed like common burglars. They are wearing business suits and thin blue surgical gloves. They carry walkie-talkies, cameras loaded with high-speed film, lock-picking tools, and thousands of dollars in sequentially numbered $100 bills. They have electronic eavesdropping equipment. This is not a simple smash-and-grab for petty cash or typewriters. The men are arrested without a fight. At the precinct, they give false names. But their real identities soon emerge, and the first hints of a deeper story appear. One is James McCord, Jr., a former CIA officer who, at the time of his arrest, is the security coordinator for the committee to re-elect the president. The other 4 are Cuban exiles from Miami, veterans of the CIA-backed Bay of Pigs invasion. This was no ordinary crew. The next day, the White House press secretary Ron Ziegler would dismiss the incident with a contemptuous wave of the hand, calling it a third-rate burglary attempt. It was a line meant to kill the story, to frame it as a minor, irrelevant police blotter item in the middle of a presidential election year. And for a time it seemed to work, but the story would not die, because the Watergate break-in was never just about a break-in. It was a single, exposed symptom of a deep and malignant disease. It was the moment a secret war, waged in the shadows by the highest office in the land against its perceived enemies, stumbled out into the light. Today, we dissect the anatomy of a presidential cover-up. We will trace the threads from that single piece of tape to the Oval Office, exploring how a culture of paranoia and a lust for power led to a criminal conspiracy that held a nation captive and ultimately forced the only resignation of a U.S. president in history. To understand the crime, you must first understand the man at its center and the world as he saw it. Richard Milhous Nixon was a man of immense ambition, intelligence, and discipline, yet he was also a man perpetually haunted by his own resentments. He saw himself as a political outsider, a product of working-class California forever battling a hostile establishment of East Coast elites. A liberal media, he believed, was determined to destroy him, and a network of political enemies who sought to undermine him at every turn. This sense of persecution was not new. It had defined his entire career. It was there in his famous 1952 Chequers speech, where he defended himself against accusations of financial impropriety by appealing directly to the public. It was there in his narrow, bitter loss to John F. Kennedy in the 1960 presidential election, a defeat he attributed to media bias and voter fraud. And it was there in his infamous last press conference after losing the 1962 California gubernatorial race, where he snarled at reporters, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore." By 1972, he was at the apex of his power, a popular incumbent president, cruising toward a landslide re-election. He had opened relations with China, pursued détente with the Soviet Union, and was winding down the war in Vietnam. Yet, the White House he presided over was not a place of confident authority, but a fortress besieged by a palpable and suffocating paranoia. The late 1960s and early 70s were a time of profound national turmoil. The Vietnam War raged, fueling massive anti-war protests that filled the streets. The counterculture movement challenged traditional values. To Nixon and his inner circle, America was under attack from within. They saw these protests not as legitimate dissent, but as subversive, even treasonous acts orchestrated by their political foes. This siege mentality was the fertile soil in which the Watergate conspiracy took root. His inner circle, the so-called Berlin Wall, of Chief of Staff H.R. Bob Haldeman and Domestic Affairs Advisor John Ehrlichman, insulated him and amplified his darkest instincts. They cultivated an us versus them ethos where loyalty to the president was the ultimate virtue, and all actions taken in his defense were, by definition, justified. In June of 1971, this paranoia was given a terrifying new focus. A military analyst named Daniel Ellsberg, who had become a fierce opponent of the Vietnam War, leaked a top-secret study of the conflict to the New York Times. The documents, which came to be known as the Pentagon Papers, revealed a decades-long history of government deception, showing that successive presidential administrations had systematically lied to the American public about the war's progress and purpose. Nixon was enraged. While the papers mostly detailed the deceptions of his Democratic predecessors, he saw the leak as a direct assault on the institution of the presidency itself, a catastrophic threat to national security, and an act of personal betrayal. He wanted the leaks stopped, and he wanted the leakers punished and publicly destroyed. In response, a secret Special Investigations Unit was formed within the White House. Its official purpose was to plug leaks. Its unofficial nickname, coined by one of its own members, was the Plumbers, led by former CIA officer E. Howard Hunt and former FBI agent G. Gordon Liddy. The plumbers operated outside the normal channels of law enforcement and intelligence. They answered directly to John Ehrlichman. Their mandate was simple and chilling: do whatever it takes. Their very first major operation was a dry run for the kind of brazen criminality that would define Watergate. In September 1971, they broke into the office of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist in Beverly Hills, hoping to find embarrassing information they could leak to the press to discredit him. They found nothing, but a critical line had been crossed. The White House was now actively engaged in state-sponsored burglary against a private citizen. The machinery of Watergate was in place and had been tested. The plumbers' attention soon shifted from national security leaks to political espionage. As the 1972 election approached, the focus became defeating the Democrats. Gordon Liddy, a man of fanatical, almost cartoonish zeal, he once held his hand over a lit candle to prove his toughness, was moved from the White House to the committee to re-elect the president, known by its unfortunate acronym, CREEP. There, he drew up a plan for a massive campaign of political sabotage and intelligence gathering, codenamed Operation Gemstone. It was a Baroque fantasy of crime, involving mugging squads to rough up protesters, yachts staffed with prostitutes to blackmail Democratic politicians, and surveillance planes to eavesdrop on opponents. The initial plan, with a budget of $1 million, was deemed too expensive and far too insane, even by the Nixon team. But a scaled-down version was eventually approved by CREEP's director, John Mitchell, who had recently stepped down as Nixon's Attorney General. The budget was $250,000. The primary target was the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate. The precise goal of the break-in has been a subject of debate for decades. The most prominent theory is that they were seeking information on DNC Chairman Larry O'Brien. Before his DNC role, O'Brien had been a lobbyist for the reclusive billionaire Howard Hughes, and the Nixon campaign was obsessed with uncovering a secret financial relationship between Hughes and the Democrats that they could use for political leverage and blackmail. Whatever the specific goal, the mission was clear: plant listening devices in the DNC offices and photograph sensitive documents. A team was assembled, led by James McCord, CREEP's security chief, and featuring the same crew of anti-Castro Cubans who had worked with Hunt on the Ellsberg job. These were not common criminals. They were men like Bernard Barker, who saw themselves as soldiers in the long war against communism. Hunt had convinced them that this operation was a matter of national security, subtly implying that the Democrats were receiving money from Fidel Castro's Cuba. Their first attempt on the weekend of May 27, 1972, was partially successful. They broke in and planted 2 listening devices. One was placed on the phone of a secretary, the other on the phone of Larry O'Brien himself. For weeks they listened from a nearby hotel room, but the intelligence they gathered was useless, mostly logistical chatter about travel plans and schedules. Worse, the bug on O'Brien's phone never worked properly, and so, on the night of June 16th, they decided to go back in. It was a fateful, arrogant, and ultimately catastrophic decision. This second attempt was a catalogue of errors. They taped the door locks in the basement garage, a simple but clumsy move that would be their undoing. The team was inside the DNC offices, trying to fix the faulty bug and rummaging through files, when Frank Wills made his second round, and saw the tape had been replaced. The third-rate burglary had begun, and with it, the countdown to a presidency's self-destruction. In the immediate hours after the arrests, a furious and panicked effort to contain the damage began. The primary link back to the White House was E. Howard Hunt. His name and White House phone number were found in the address books of two of the burglars. Inside the White House, a frantic cleanup operation swung into motion. John Dean, the ambitious 33-year-old White House counsel, was tasked with managing the fallout. He ordered G. Gordon Liddy to have Hunt's office at the White House sanitized. Liddy, in turn, told an aide to get everything out. The aide, in a fit of panic, simply dumped the contents of Hunt's safe, including listening devices, spy gear, and a bogus State Department cable fabricated to frame John F. Kennedy for the assassination of the South Vietnamese president, into a trash can. Later, realizing the catastrophic stupidity of this move, the sensitive materials were retrieved. They were eventually passed to L. Patrick Gray, the acting director of the FBI, by John Dean and John Ehrlichman, with the implicit instruction that they should never see the light of day. Gray, a Nixon loyalist, hoping for a permanent appointment, took the files home and burned them in his fireplace, a profound act of obstruction. The cover-up was now in motion. It operated on two primary fronts: public deception and private obstruction. Publicly, the White House strategy was to deny, dismiss, and deflect. Press Secretary Ron Ziegler's third-rate burglary comment was the opening salvo. President Nixon himself, on June 22, just 5 days after the break-in, declared categorically that the White House has had no involvement whatever in this particular incident. It was a bold and unequivocal lie. Privately, the conspiracy was far more complex and criminal. The first and most critical objective was to stop the FBI investigation from tracing the crime back to Creep and, ultimately, to the White House. This is where the infamous smoking gun conversation took place, though its contents would not be known for 2 more years. On June 23, 1972, Nixon met in the Oval Office with his Chief of Staff, H.R. Haldeman. They discussed the FBI's investigation, specifically its success in tracing the sequentially numbered $100 bills found on the burglars. The money had been traced from a Miami bank, through a Mexican lawyer, and back to a Creep fundraising account. The trail was leading directly to the president's re-election campaign. Nixon, his voice captured by his own secret taping system, approved a plan. They would use the Central Intelligence Agency to interfere with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Haldeman would tell the CIA that the Watergate investigation could expose some of their covert operations, a complete fabrication. The CIA, they hoped, would then tell the FBI to back off for reasons of national security. Nixon told Haldeman to say that the investigation was a problem for us. It was a clear, unambiguous, and illegal order to obstruct justice. The second front of the cover-up was financial. The 5 burglars and their 2 handlers, Hunt and Liddy, needed to be silenced. They were facing serious criminal charges and long prison sentences. The White House feared they would talk in exchange for leniency. The solution was hush money. Over the next several months, a secret slush fund, controlled by Nixon's personal attorney Herbert Kalmbach, dispensed hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash to the defendants and their lawyers. The money was delivered in clandestine drops in phone booths and hotel lobbies, sometimes stuffed into envelopes and left on ledges. The message was clear: keep quiet, plead guilty, and you and your families will be taken care of. It was witness tampering and obstruction of justice on a massive scale, funded by leftover campaign contributions laundered through a series of intermediaries. For a while, it worked. The burglars remained silent. The investigation stalled. Nixon won the 1972 election in one of the biggest landslides in American history. The cover-up, it seemed, was holding. While the White House projected an image of total victory, and the Justice Department's investigation seemed to stop at Liddy, two young reporters at the Washington Post refused to let the story die. Bob Woodward was a former naval intelligence officer, a quiet, relentless digger with a Yale education. Carl Bernstein was a long-haired college dropout with a reputation as a brilliant, if tempestuous, writer. They were an unlikely pair, assigned to the local news desk to cover what at first seemed like a routine court story. But their editors, particularly Metropolitan editor Harry Rosenfeld, saw the potential for more. They were persistent. They knocked on doors. They worked their sources. They made hundreds of phone calls, often finding only dead ends and slammed doors. And slowly, piece by piece, they began to connect the dots that the official investigation was missing. Their most important source was a high-level figure in the executive branch whom Woodward had known from his time in the Navy. They code-named him Deep Throat. They would meet in secret in the dead of night in an underground parking garage in Rosslyn, Virginia. Woodward would signal a meeting by moving a flower pot on his balcony. The source would signal a reply by drawing a clock face in Woodward's copy of the New York Times. The source would never give them new information directly. Instead, he would confirm what they had already learned from other sources and guide their reporting, helping them understand the bigger picture of a covert campaign of political espionage and sabotage. His most famous piece of advice became the mantra of the investigation: follow the money. And that's what they did. They traced the $100 bills found on the burglars back through a series of bizarre transactions to a creep bank account, uncovering the secret slush fund used for political espionage. They reported that John Mitchell had personally controlled the fund while he was Attorney General. They revealed the extent of Donald Segretti's rat-fucking campaign, a series of dirty tricks designed to sabotage Democratic primary candidates, like distributing fake press releases on a rival campaign's letterhead. Woodward and Bernstein's reporting was often derided by the White House as partisan gossip and shoddy journalism. Ron Ziegler repeatedly attacked their work, famously saying the Post was engaging in the shoddiest type of journalism. They faced immense pressure and public criticism. But their editor, Ben Bradley, and the publisher of the Post, Katharine Graham, stood by them, risking the paper's reputation and financial stability. Their stories kept the scandal alive during the fall of 1972. For decades, the identity of Deep Throat was one of Washington's greatest mysteries. It was not until 2005 that he was revealed to be Mark Felt, the associate director of the FBI. Felt felt he had been passed over for the top job, and was disgusted by the White House's attempts to corrupt the Bureau's investigation. He saw the press as the only way to ensure the truth came out. The new year, 1973, began with the trial of the 7 original Watergate defendants. 5 pleaded guilty. The other 2, G. Gordon Liddy and James McCord, were quickly convicted. The White House hoped this would be the end of it, but the federal judge presiding over the case, John J. Sirica, was not convinced he was getting the whole story. A former boxer and a staunch Republican, Sirica was known as Maximum John for his tough sentencing. He believed higher UPS were involved, and was deeply offended by what he saw as a fraud being perpetrated on his court. He read a statement during the trial making it clear he suspected a cover-up. He then used his power to dramatic effect. He gave the convicted men provisional sentences of up to 40 years in prison, strongly suggesting that these sentences could be reduced if they decided to cooperate more fully with investigators. The pressure worked. In March 1973, just before his final sentencing, James McCord, the former CIA officer and creep security chief, wrote a letter to Judge Sirica. It was a bombshell. McCord alleged that he and the other defendants had been pressured by White House figures to plead guilty and remain silent. He claimed that political pressure had been applied to him from John Dean and John Mitchell's deputy, Jeb Magruder. He alleged that perjury had been committed during the trial, and that senior White House officials were involved in the planning and financing of the break-in. McCord's letter was the first major crack in the wall of silence. The dam was about to break. McCord's revelations sent a shockwave through the White House. The cover-up, once a tightly controlled operation, was rapidly spiraling out of control. No one felt this more acutely than the President's counsel, John Dean. For months, Dean had been the central manager of the conspiracy. He had coached witnesses, relayed requests for hush money, and destroyed evidence. But now he saw himself being set up as the designated scapegoat, the one who would take the fall, to protect the men at the very top. Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and the President himself. He decided his only option was to cooperate with federal prosecutors. On March 21, 1973, Dean went to the Oval Office for a meeting that would become legendary. He looked President Nixon in the eye and delivered a chilling warning. "I began by telling the President," Dean would later testify, "that there was a cancer on the presidency, that it was growing daily." He proceeded to lay out the entire criminal conspiracy in stunning detail: the perjury, the hush money, the obstruction of justice. He told Nixon that the cost of keeping the defendants quiet could be $1 million or more. Nixon's response, captured on his own secret tapes, was not horror or outrage. It was the calm calculation of a co-conspirator. He told Dean, "You could get $1 million, and you could get it in cash. I know where it could be gotten." Far from putting a stop to the crime, the President was actively exploring ways to continue it, discussing the logistics of the blackmail payment. As Dean began talking to prosecutors, the scandal exploded into public view. On April 30th, Nixon addressed the nation, announcing the resignations of his two closest aides, Haldeman and Ehrlichman, as well as John Dean. He appointed a new Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, and gave him the authority to appoint an independent special prosecutor to investigate the matter. Meanwhile, in May 1973, the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, better known as the Senate Watergate Committee, began nationally televised hearings. For an entire summer, the American public was riveted as a parade of witnesses, from low-level operatives to the highest officials in the White House, testified under oath. The hearings, chaired by the folksy but firm Senator Sam Ervin of North Carolina, transformed the story from a newspaper saga into a national trauma. The committee's Republican vice chairman, Howard Baker, framed the central question that hung over the proceedings. What did the President know, and when did he know it? The star witness was John Dean. For 5 days in late June, he sat before the committee and, in a flat, unemotional monotone, read a 245-page statement that implicated himself, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, John Mitchell, and President Nixon in the cover-up. It was his word against the President's. The White House launched a furious campaign to discredit him, painting him as a disgruntled liar and the mastermind of the plot. For a time, it was a stalemate of credibility. But then, on July 16, 1973, during a routine interview, a committee staffer asked a little-known White House aide named Alexander Butterfield a speculative question. Was there any kind of recording system in the Oval Office? Butterfield, under oath and with no other choice, had to tell the truth. Yes, he answered. President Nixon had secretly recorded virtually every conversation he had had in the Oval Office and on his office telephones since 1971. The revelation of the White House taping system changed everything. Suddenly, there was a way to verify who was telling the truth and who was lying. There was hard, objective evidence. John Dean's testimony could be checked against the president's own words. The tapes immediately became the central focus of the entire investigation. The Senate committee subpoenaed them. The new special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, a Harvard law professor appointed by Elliot Richardson, also subpoenaed them. Nixon refused to comply. He claimed executive privilege, arguing that a president's private conversations must remain confidential for the government to function. The stage was set for a constitutional showdown between the president, the Congress, and the courts. The battle for the tapes reached its climax in the fall of 1973. Special Prosecutor Cox was relentless. He believed the tapes were essential evidence in a criminal investigation and refused to accept Nixon's offer of a compromise, which would have allowed a single, trusted senator to listen to the tapes and verify a White House-prepared summary. Cox saw this as an unacceptable infringement on his independence. Enraged by Cox's refusal to back down, Nixon decided to take a drastic and unprecedented step. He would fire him. On the evening of Saturday, October 20, 1973, Nixon ordered his Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, to fire Archibald Cox. Richardson, who had personally guaranteed the Senate during his confirmation hearings that the special prosecutor would have full independence, refused the direct order. He resigned in protest. Nixon then turned to the Deputy Attorney General, William Ruckelshaus. He too refused to carry out the order and was promptly fired. Finally, Nixon found a man willing to do his bidding, the third in command at the Justice Department, Solicitor General Robert Bork. Bork signed the letter dismissing Cox. The FBI was sent to seal off the special prosecutor's offices. The event was immediately dubbed the Saturday Night Massacre. It was a staggering abuse of presidential power, and the public reaction was a firestorm of outrage. Telegrams and letters flooded into Washington, running 150 to 1 against the president. Members of Congress from both parties were inundated with furious calls from their constituents. The Saturday Night Massacre was perhaps Nixon's single greatest political miscalculation. In trying to kill the investigation, he had instead proven to millions of Americans that he had something to hide. The crisis was so severe that, for the first time, talk of impeachment moved from the political fringe to the mainstream. Facing immense pressure, the White House was forced to appoint a new special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, and grudgingly agreed to hand over some of the subpoenaed tapes. The tapes that were finally turned over only deepened the suspicion. One key conversation from June 20, 1972, just 3 days after the break-in, contained a mysterious and deeply suspicious gap. For 18.5 minutes, all that could be heard was an ominous buzz. The White House blamed the gap on a technical malfunction. Nixon's personal secretary, Rosemary Woods, offered a bizarre explanation, claiming she might have accidentally erased a portion of the tape while transcribing it by keeping her foot on a pedal while answering the phone. She demonstrated for the press a contorted posture, soon nicknamed the Rosemary Stretch, that was widely ridiculed as implausible. A panel of court-appointed forensic experts later determined that the gap was the result of at least 5, and perhaps as many as 9, separate, deliberate erasures. The contents of those 18.5 minutes have never been recovered. The missing evidence was, in its own way, as damning as any conversation. As 1974 began, the legal and political vice was tightening around the president. In March, a grand jury indicted 7 of Nixon's top aides, including Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Mitchell, for their roles in the cover-up. In a sealed briefcase delivered to Judge Sirica, the grand jury also named Richard Nixon as an unindicted co-conspirator. Meanwhile, the House of Representatives Judiciary Committee had formally begun its impeachment inquiry. Special Prosecutor Jaworski continued to press for more tapes, specifically 64 conversations he believed contained further evidence of the cover-up. Nixon again refused, citing executive privilege. The case, United States versus Nixon, went all the way to the Supreme Court. On July 24, 1974, the court delivered its verdict. In a unanimous 8-0 decision, they ruled against the president. The justices acknowledged the principle of executive privilege, but declared that it was not absolute. The need for evidence in a criminal trial, they argued, outweighed a president's general claim of confidentiality. Richard Nixon was ordered to turn over the tapes. His final line of defense had crumbled. At the same time, the House Judiciary Committee, after months of closed-door hearings, began its public televised debate on articles of impeachment. Over the course of 6 days, the committee voted to approve 3 articles against the president. The first charged him with obstruction of justice for his role in the Watergate cover-up, detailing specific acts like making false statements, withholding evidence, and paying hush money. The second charged him with abuse of power, citing his misuse of the FBI, the CIA, and the IRS to harass political opponents, and his authorization of illegal wiretaps. The third charged him with contempt of Congress for defying their subpoenas for the tapes. The vote was bipartisan, with several Republicans joining the Democratic majority. Impeachment by the full House was now a certainty, and a trial in the Senate loomed. The final, fatal blow came on August 5, 1974. In compliance with the Supreme Court's order, the White House released the transcripts of the remaining subpoenaed tapes. Among them was the recording from June 23, 1972, just 6 days after the break-in. It was the conversation between Nixon and H.R. Haldeman, where they explicitly discussed using the CIA to block the FBI's investigation. This was the smoking gun. It was incontrovertible proof that Nixon had not only known about the cover-up from the very beginning, but had personally directed it. It was the final, devastating lie. For 2 years, he had insisted he was not involved. His own voice now proved his guilt beyond any doubt. The release of the smoking gun tape obliterated what little political support Nixon had left. The 10 Republicans on the Judiciary Committee who had voted against impeachment announced they would now vote in favor of it on the House floor. Nixon's own lawyers, listening to the tape for the first time, knew the case was lost. Accounts from his final days describe a president in turmoil, drinking heavily, wandering the halls of the White House late at night, and talking to the portraits of his predecessors. The most powerful Republican leaders in Congress, including Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona and House Minority Leader John Rhodes, went to the White House. They met with the president and delivered the grim news. His support in the Senate had collapsed. He faced certain conviction and removal from office. The choice was his: resign or be impeached and removed in disgrace. On the evening of August 8, 1974, Richard Nixon addressed the nation from the Oval Office. He announced that he would resign the presidency, effective at noon the following day. He never admitted to any criminal wrongdoing, stating only that he was resigning because he no longer had a strong enough political base in the Congress to govern. The next morning, he gave a tearful, rambling farewell speech to his staff before boarding the Marine One helicopter from the White House lawn. As the helicopter lifted off, he turned and gave his signature to Armed Victory Wave. Then he was gone. Minutes later, Vice President Gerald Ford was sworn in as the 38th President of the United States, declaring, "My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over." 1 month later, President Ford granted Richard Nixon a full, free, and absolute pardon for any and all crimes he may have committed as president, a controversial decision that Ford argued was necessary to heal the nation, but which many saw as a final act that placed the president above the law. The fallout from Watergate was immense. More than 30 administration officials and campaign aides, including some of the most powerful men in the country, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Mitchell, Dean, would go to prison for their crimes. The scandal ushered in a new era of cynicism and distrust toward government from which the country has arguably never fully recovered. It led to sweeping campaign finance reforms and new ethics in government laws. It elevated investigative journalism to a new level of prestige and influence. But its core lesson lies in the anatomy of the crime itself. The anatomy of the Watergate cover-up is not merely a story of a burglary gone wrong. It is a case study in the pathology of power. It reveals how a leader's deep-seated paranoia, combined with the unquestioning loyalty of his subordinates, can create an environment where the law is seen not as a sacred boundary, but as a political obstacle to be overcome. The conspiracy structure was layered and insidious. It began with the initial act of containment, using the instruments of national security, the CIA, to obstruct a criminal investigation by the FBI. This was followed by the systematic corruption of individuals through the distribution of hush money, turning defendants into paid conspirators. It then escalated to the corruption of the legal process itself, through widespread perjury and witness tampering. And when all else failed, it culminated in the ultimate abuse of presidential power, the firing of the special prosecutor, and the assertion that the president himself was above the judicial process. At the heart of it all was a secret taping system, a machine installed by a president obsessed with his historical legacy. He believed the tapes would be his ultimate vindication, a verbatim record of his triumphs for future generations to study and admire. Instead, they became the instrument of his destruction. They were the primary witness against him, a cold electronic record of conspiracy that could not be cross-examined, intimidated, or bought. The system designed to preserve his voice for history ended up preserving his crimes for posterity. The entire edifice of a presidency, with all its immense power and authority, was brought down not by a grand conspiracy of its enemies, but by the quiet click of a door lock that refused to stay shut. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.